how did Elric of Molnibbane, particularly the earlier work in the 60s and 70s, influence the early days of Dungeons and Dragons? At the Appendix N chats are a series where I talk about the official, inverted commas, influences that Gary Gygax cited on his work in Dungeons and Dragons. And Elric's an important one. It's one that is, and particularly important in terms of what people say is important for those early days of Dungeons and Dragons. It's new wave sword and sorcery from particularly the 60s and into the early 70s, and then a later revival through the late 80s onwards. The DMG is from 1970, well, no, 1979, 1980, and so we're talking about that earlier stuff. And this is most of the books there. This is the collections Elric of Molnibbane and Other Stories, Sail on the Seas of Fate, and Stormbringer. And there are a couple of the novellas and one expanded into a novel, which I don't have, which aren't here. And I think one reason Elric is identified closely by some people with Gygax is that particularly once Gygax pushes back against the idea that it's heavily influenced by Lord of the Rings. It's influenced, but not heavily. It's connected in some people's minds with Moorcock's criticisms of Tolkien. I think those are essentially completely irrelevant and disconnected points, even if both were true. As it is, I don't think Gygax was really able to distance himself from Lord of the Rings. He was just annoyed at the Tolkien estate. And I think with Elric, it can be easy to overstate his influence. And I'll pick up one or two points there as I go. But on the whole, Elric is a big influence on earliest D&D. And was an iconic sword and sorcery second wave or third wave sword and sorcery character of the era. Elric is a tortured elf, basically. Functionally, he's a sort of pale albino with red eyes, white hair, carries a vampiric sword. He's the last emperor, functionally, of a decadent and evil civilization, but who are nonetheless, in many ways, more advanced than the humans around them, more amazing and incredible than the humans around them. He tests traditional morality. He's tormented by his conscience, but he's torn both ways between the kind of almost philosophical conscience side of him and his Melnibonéan and Emirian heritage. Now, a bit of Elric, a side of Elric, which I don't think really plays into anything I can see in early D&D, is actually Elric and the anti-heroic character, the new wave, tortured hero, the big, in that sense, the big epic stakes stuff. I don't think that is a big influence in early D&D. I think you see that influence pass through cycles in RPGs. I think it is probably not necessarily directly, but as much integral to World of Darkness as anything, because it's part of the same movement that gives rise to that idea of disaffected counterculture coming back in the 80s and 90s. I think it's also certainly something which you can imagine plenty of people playing from the 70s, 80s, 90s, noughties, 10s, 20s. In all those eras, people who have wanted big heroic or anti-heroic stakes in their campaigns will have been influenced by. But Gary Gygax, particularly the mechanics, core monsters, core systems, core ideas of Dungeons and Dragons in the original first and arguably basic editions, nope, I don't see that. But in fact, here's another place where you could overstate the influence, and then I'm going to get onto some places where it very obviously is significantly influential. Lore and chaos are a major theme in Moorcock. A philosophical theme, should lore win? Should chaos win? What's better? And Moorcock generally says, there may or may not be a god up there who knows the cosmic hand, but the balance here, which is above good and evil. So, much like on an actual pair of balances, the idea that lore and chaos need some degree of balance for there to be balance, and balance is good. That's big in Moorcock, and you could see some of that reflected in maybe more the ninefold system than the threefold system of original, the ninefold system of first, where we have true neutrality seen as the art of achieving the balance. Nonetheless, Moorcock himself credits, and it's an essay in this one, in Stormbringer, a supporting essay, he credits the Three Hearts and Three Lions, Law and Chaos stuff as the basis for what he's into, and Law and Chaos as opposing poles are much better represented by how Poul Anderson sees them in that novel than by how they are seen by Moorcock. I think the sheer importance of Law and Chaos must be influential on Gygax, who had read these books, who, particularly Stormbringer, liked them. In that, Elric is an agent of fate, but they're really to serve the forces of law. In fact, in some senses, though there's an idea there needs to be a balance, Stormbringer is one of the ones where the stakes are very obvious that it's right to fight for law, because in this situation, to have a functional, stable world, we need more law than chaos. So in that sense, it is something where Gygax could have looked at it and seen the same ideas as in Three Hearts and Three Lions. I don't know which you read first. I don't know what he thought was more influential, but you would not want to overstate Moorcock bringing in Law and Chaos to Gygax, given his view of Law and Chaos is not very close to Moorcock's. Law is essentially, if it's opposed to Chaos, better to Gygax. Things that are influential, though, there's a lot of things that I think you can see as influential. An obvious one, Rhys Stormbringer, which is, I think, in all the front pictures on these, Stormbringer, is the idea of magical swords. In Stormbringer's case, a semi-intelligent magical sword. I think that's a very obviously Moorcockian idea, which has other early parallels. There are other people who have, you get particularly Magitex, semi-magical items in Lee Brackett, for instance. You certainly get technology and other key Gygax influences. You do get things which look like magic items elsewhere, and artifacts, and Lord of the Rings is an obvious one for that. But for Moorcock, the fact that particularly Stormbringer, but other items as well, both weapons and other things, there is a constant array of magical or semi-magical technological items throughout his books, and I think the most famous of them, Stormbringer, is the one which feels most obviously D&D-ish, because it's a weapon, it's a sword, which is really the iconic weapon of D&D, and it's the idea is kind of intelligent, it can suck souls. It's the basis of evil intelligent swords, isn't it? I think something that strikes me as a strong influence, not unique but probably very strong, is his perception, and I think you can trace this to the DMG in terms of the planes that Gygax sketches out there, much more expanded by Jeff Grubb in Manual of the Planes particularly, and then later into, most importantly in second edition, I think, when you really see the full kind of here's all the detail. But that first sketch in the DMG, I think the idea that you have elemental planes with elemental lords and powers who live in essentially extensions of that material, that is something which you'll find in Stormbringer particularly, but also all the way back to Elric, the idea of earth elementals, air elementals, etc. But the idea that there is this these elemental worlds, but that they are distinct from where demons and who are chaos, the leaders of chaos, and where the white lords, the lords of law, are. There are also grey lords or lords of balance or something. And this is where, as I say, some of this probably does influence Gygax and some of it doesn't, and you could see some of it there too. But yes, I think the idea of elementals being contactable, dealable beings, princes, kings, and again the fact that they are distinct from demons, angels, whatever else, and that's on a separate outer planes, if you will. I think that seems to me a very clear influence. It's different. An obvious influence for elementals and dealing with elementals is Sandestines in The Dying Earth, except that those are also maybe presented as demons. They're kind of the same thing. There are demons in The Dying Earth. They are much less like your monster manual details of, well, certainly of devils and demons, and demon lords. Ariok is a demon lord you could get in, well, sorry, I say this, you will get one day in Deities and Demigods. That's an obvious thing, as Melniboné is itself something where the canon, the pantheons are brought over into Deities and Demigods, and that one, I think, in that case was official and licensed. But the point is that well, correct me if it was that, or so. I think it was Lovecraft at that point that wasn't licensed, wasn't it? It was Cthulhu. But yes, so obviously, the that stuff is brought directly into Deities and Demigods. It is an official influence on him, but moreover, it's much more like your monster manual demon lords or even devil lords than the Sandes demons and demons. Very minor, really tiny spirits of the Dying Earth series. So yes, planar stuff. Multiversal stuff here. You see it in a few other books as well on his list, on Appendix N, World of Tears, for instance, and The Incomplete Enchanter. But I think the idea that there are multiple prime materials and that they can interact. This is one place that crops up. I don't think it's the strong influence on Gygax, but another one actually is Chronicles of Amber that does the same, that is an Appendix N, or at least Zelazny is an Appendix N entry. But yes, so I think that's an obvious kind of set of influences. What else would I say is a big influence on Moorcock? Probably, on Moorcock, on Gygax. I think arguably the last thing I think I'll say is, magic is not Vancian, but there is a shade of that tradition, and the style, the Baroque nature is something which Moorcock emphasises, which I think actually Gygax somewhat, even in first edition, it becomes even more so post Gygax, but he emphasises this Baroque and complex nature of magic. I think the idea that elves have a degree of internal magic could be as naturally drawn if you read Elric as an elf and other Melnibonéans as elves. It could be as naturally drawn from the innate sorcery, the innate sorcerous ability of the Melnibonéans as from the pseudo-magical nature of elves in Tolkien. And so the elf in original D&D, who is a fighter magic user, could be perceived in that light, I think. You could probably pick up as well tropes here and there of classes, but I'm not sure. You could say, is this kind of fellow that there's a priest who Elric meets in another world, actually, through the Black Gate, is it, or through the Crooked Gate, or whatever it's called, in Elric of Melniboné. There's the Red Priest. Is he potentially an influence on the cleric, in the sense that he has this sort of de-Christianized but semi-paganized, repaganized imagery? Yes, maybe, but it's not a very strong influence. Again, there's things where you can see tropes that are influential going forward, but not necessarily to Gygax, and by that I mean to kind of weapon styles, character styles, Moonglum with his two swords, things like that. One final point is, in terms of lore and chaos, if you want a place where chaos at least, maybe lore as well, but chaos at least is evidently enormously influential, is not Gygax, but via their publication of things related to Moorcock, Games Workshop, and Warhammer 40,000. The 8-pointed Star of Chaos, potentially drawn by Moorcock, I think this is accepted, it is from the Eight of Wands interpretation of Aleister Crowley of dynamism. But the 8-pointed Star of Chaos is, in that form, a Moorcockian creation, and I may be able to find an image here. I can't promise it. But yeah, I think that is something where, if you are looking for a really obvious influence on a role-playing game or on a setting, the fact that the flesh-warping nature of the stuff of chaos is much more of a Moorcockian chaotic principle drawn into 40k and Warhammer Fantasy than it is a Lovecraftian principle. The Lovecraftian stuff of chaos is psychological chiefly rather than physical, whereas Moorcock physicalizes that. There are hints of that, of course, in some D&D monsters, say even some of the Slard, things like that, and the idea that things could mutate and warp you, but it's not a particularly strong theme, and it needn't even come necessarily from Moorcock. But yes, if there are influences that are obvious, and I'm sure there are, that I've missed, if there are other things maybe subtler or thematic or tropes that you can see Gygax drawing on Moorcock in Elric, particularly from, please do tell me in the comments. I think it's obvious that Elric is one of the more important influences in terms of a set of identifiable things. I don't think it's up there with, your Conans, your Lovecrafts, your John Carter of Mars's sort of thing, but I think it's in the second tier of very strong influences. That's where I put it. Anyway, tell me what you think. Till next time.